Silence doesn't explain itself. It just repeats until you stop asking why. There's a specific kind of silence that changes everything. Not the silence of a missed call or a delayed text, but the kind that stretches across days, then weeks, then becomes the rhythm itself. It's the silence that stops feeling like an interruption and starts feeling like a pattern. Relationship psychology teaches that behavior, not words, is the most reliable form of communication. And when someone's behavior becomes defined by absence, that absence is the message. This isn't about one conversation that went wrong or one moment of distance. It's about the accumulation of small, repeated withdrawals that quietly rewrite the terms of connection. Emotional behavior responds to consistency. The nervous system tracks what happens reliably, not what's promised occasionally. When someone begins to pull back, not dramatically, but steadily, the other person feels it before they understand it. Attachment patterns activate in response to perceived threat, and sustained emotional distance registers as exactly that. Psychological dynamics shift. The person who used to feel close now feels remote. The person who used to respond now doesn't. And the one left waiting begins to recalibrate their entire sense of where they stand. Behavior analysis reveals what words often obscure. When someone stops showing up, they've already made a choice. They just haven't said it out loud. What makes this pattern so psychologically disorienting is that it rarely announces itself. There's no conversation where someone says, "I'm pulling away." There's just a gradual reduction in effort, in presence, in emotional availability. The person experiencing emotional withdrawal often spends weeks trying to explain it. Stress, timing, circumstance. But explanations only matter if behavior eventually aligns with them. When the distance continues regardless of explanation, the mind begins to read a different truth. Relationship patterns aren't built on intention, they're built on action. And when action consistently communicates absence, the relationship is already operating under new terms. The question isn't whether things have changed. The question is whether the person waiting will accept what the silence has been saying all along. There's a specific moment when silence shifts from being something that happens to something that registers. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly between one unanswered message and the next, in the space where a response used to live. The mind doesn't immediately label it as absence. It first notices the texture of waiting, the slight discomfort of checking again. This is where emotional behavior begins its quiet documentation. The silence isn't loud. It's just there, occupying space that used to hold something else, and the shift from accidental to intentional starts to take shape without permission. What makes this moment distinct is not the silence itself, but the awareness of it. Relationship psychology teaches that patterns emerge through repetition, but recognition begins with a single instance that feels different. The brain scans for explanations, busy, tired, distracted, and finds them easily at first. But underneath, a quieter process has started. The nervous system begins cataloging. It notes duration, frequency, the quality of absence. This isn't paranoia. It's pattern recognition doing what it was designed to do. Attachment patterns activate not when something goes wrong once, but when the mind starts preparing for it to happen again. The silence that registers is different from the silence that gets explained away. It carries weight. It lingers in a way that accidental delays don't. There's a subtle tension in the body when the phone stays quiet. A low-grade alertness that wasn't there before. Psychological dynamics shift at this threshold. The person isn't yet worried. They're aware. And awareness, once it settles in, doesn't leave easily. It watches. It waits. It starts measuring distance in timestamps and emotional withdrawal in the gaps between words. The relationship hasn't changed visibly yet, but something internal has already moved. This is not the moment everything falls apart. It's the moment the mind begins to notice that something might. The silence is still explainable, still deniable, still wrapped in the possibility of coincidence. But beneath that surface, a question has formed. And once it forms, it doesn't ask just once. It repeats quietly, every time the silence happens again. Behavior analysis begins here. Not with answers, but with the first noticing. And noticing, in relationship dynamics, is where everything that follows takes root. When someone who used to reply consistently begins to pull back, the shift registers viscerally before it registers logically. It's not about one delayed response. It's about the contrast. The person who once checked in, who used to close loops, who had a rhythm, suddenly doesn't. And the change isn't gradual. It's a drop. Sharp enough to feel but subtle enough to question. This is where emotional behavior begins to conflict with prior evidence. The mind searches recent history for clues, trying to reconcile what was with what is. Relationship psychology identifies this as a rupture in predictability, and predictability is one of the quiet pillars of emotional safety. The drop feels disorienting because it lacks explanation. There's no fight, no obvious trigger, no visible shift in circumstance. Just a person who used to be present, now operating at a different frequency. Attachment patterns respond to this kind of inconsistency with heightened monitoring. The nervous system doesn't accept sudden changes passively. It assigns meaning. It asks whether the change is temporary or structural, whether it's stress or distance, whether it's about circumstance or about connection. These questions don't always surface consciously, but they shape every interaction that follows. Emotional distance doesn't need to be named to be felt. What complicates this moment is that the person pulling back may not even recognize they're doing it. Psychological dynamics don't always operate with awareness. Someone can retreat emotionally while still technically responding. They can reduce investment without announcing it. They can shift priorities internally while maintaining a surface-level presence. This is why behavior analysis becomes essential. Words can remain polite, even warm, but the underlying rhythm tells a different story. Relationship patterns are encoded not in what people say, but in how consistently they show up. And when that consistency breaks without explanation, the other person is left holding the weight of the change alone. The drop in responsiveness doesn't conclude anything yet. It simply marks a shift in emotional availability. The person didn't disappear. They just moved further back. And that movement, however small, becomes the new baseline. The one experiencing it doesn't panic, not yet. But they do begin to recalibrate. They begin to adjust their expectations, their timing, their internal sense of where they stand. Emotional withdrawal, even when unspoken, rewrites the terms of engagement. And once those terms shift, the relationship is already operating under a new set of rules. One gap can be explained. Two can be rationalized. But when gaps begin to repeat, they stop being interruptions and start becoming structure. Each silence stretches a little longer. Each delay feels a little more familiar. And somewhere in that repetition, The mind stops waiting for things to return to normal. It begins to accept the gaps as the new normal. This is where relationship dynamics undergo a silent revision. Expectations don't collapse all at once. They erode piece by piece in the space between messages that never come. Emotional behavior adapts not to what is said, but to what is consistently withheld. The repetition is what gives the pattern its power. A single instance can be dismissed. But when the same thing happens again, and then again, the brain registers it as reliable data. Attachment patterns are highly sensitive to reliability. They track whether someone is consistently available or inconsistently present. And inconsistency, even when it's quiet, registers as a form of emotional distance. The person on the receiving end begins to lower their expectations without deciding to. They stop expecting quick replies. They stop assuming engagement. They start waiting longer before reaching out again. This isn't conscious strategy. It's self-protection, dressed as patience. What makes this shift so psychologically significant is that it happens beneath language. No conversation takes place about the growing distance. No one names the pattern. But both people feel it. The one pulling back may feel relief in the space. The one waiting feels the weight of it. Behavior analysis reveals that gaps in communication don't just represent absence, they communicate priority. When someone repeatedly delays or reduces their presence, they're signaling where their attention is actually going. And the other person, whether they admit it or not, begins to read that signal. Psychological dynamics shift not because of what's said, but because of what's no longer done. By the time the pattern has repeated enough, the relationship is already operating differently. One person has quietly stepped back. The other has quietly adjusted. Neither has announced the change, but both are living inside it. Relationship patterns solidify not through dramatic moments, but through the accumulation of small, repeated behaviors. And once expectation has been reset, going back requires more than a single message. It requires a sustained reversal of the entire pattern, which more often than not, never comes. There's a specific moment when it becomes clear that the effort being given is not being returned. It's not about keeping score. It's about noticing imbalance. One person continues to reach out, to ask, to maintain the thread. The other person responds, but doesn't initiate. They engage, but only when prompted. They participate, but don't invest. This asymmetry doesn't announce itself loudly. It builds quietly, interaction by interaction, until the pattern becomes undeniable. Emotional behavior shifts when reciprocity breaks down. The person still trying begins to feel the weight of carrying something that used to be shared. Relationship psychology identifies this as a breakdown in mutual investment. When one person is consistently doing the work of connection, sending the first message, planning the next conversation, holding space for emotional exchange, and the other is simply responding, the dynamic becomes unsustainable. Attachment patterns react strongly to perceived inequality in effort. The nervous system begins to register the imbalance as rejection, even if no explicit rejection has occurred. Psychological dynamics don't require words to shift. They shift in response to action, or the absence of it. And when effort stops being mirrored, the mind begins to ask why. This realization doesn't arrive with anger, not at first. It arrives with confusion. The person giving more begins to question their own perception. Maybe they're overreacting. Maybe the other person is just busy. Maybe effort looks different for different people. These explanations provide temporary relief, but they don't change the underlying pattern. Behavior analysis cuts through justification. It looks at what actually happens over time, consistently. And what happens is clear. One person is maintaining the relationship, and the other is allowing it to be maintained. Emotional distance grows not from hostility, but from the quiet withdrawal of participation. What makes this moment so pivotal is that it forces a decision, even if that decision remains internal. The person carrying the effort can either continue doing so, accepting the imbalance, or they can begin to pull back themselves. Neither option feels good. One requires ongoing emotional labor without return. The other requires letting go of something they're not ready to release. Relationship patterns at this stage are fragile. The imbalance has been noticed, and once noticed, it can't be unseen. The next move will either restore equilibrium or deepen the divide that's already quietly forming. At some point, the explanations stop making sense. The person who's pulling back continues to offer reasons: work stress, personal issues, exhaustion, but those reasons no longer align with what's actually happening. They say they care, but their behavior suggests otherwise. They claim they want to stay connected, but their actions create distance. This dissonance is where confusion takes root. Emotional behavior and verbal reassurance are supposed to match. When they don't, the mind enters a state of cognitive dissonance. Relationship psychology identifies this as one of the most destabilizing phases of emotional withdrawal. The person experiencing it can't reconcile what they're being told with what they're consistently shown. The confusion isn't just intellectual, it's emotional. The person waiting for alignment keeps adjusting their understanding to fit the words, then adjusting again when the behavior contradicts them. They want to believe the explanations because believing them is easier than accepting the alternative. But attachment patterns don't operate on belief. They operate on evidence. And the evidence keeps pointing in one direction. Psychological dynamics shift when the gap between language and action becomes too wide to ignore. The mind begins to distrust the words because the behavior has told a different, more consistent story. What makes this phase so disorienting is that the person pulling back may not even be lying. They may genuinely believe their own explanations. They may tell themselves they're just going through something, that things will stabilize soon, that the distance is temporary. But behavior analysis reveals intention more accurately than self-reporting does. Someone can mean to stay connected and still choose, repeatedly, not to. They can value the relationship in theory, while deprioritizing it in practice. Emotional distance doesn't require malice. It only requires sustained inaction. And inaction, over time, communicates more clearly than any explanation ever could. The confusion doesn't resolve. It accumulates. Each new explanation that doesn't match behavior adds another layer of uncertainty. The person experiencing it begins to doubt their own perception. They wonder if they're being too demanding, too sensitive, too focused on the wrong things. But beneath that self-doubt, a quieter awareness is growing. The awareness that behavior, not explanation, is the truth. That relationship patterns are built on what people do, not what they say they'll do. And that sometimes, the most honest communication is the one that never uses words at all. Eventually, the silence stops feeling temporary. It's no longer something to wait out or explain away. It's simply how things are now. The gaps have become predictable. The delays have become routine. What once felt like an anomaly now feels like the default. This is the moment when emotional behavior fully adapts to the new reality. Relationship psychology marks this as a critical transition, when reactive confusion settles into resigned recognition. The person experiencing the silence stops expecting it to change because the pattern has proven itself stable. Psychological dynamics at this stage are no longer about hoping for reconnection. They're about adjusting to distance as a permanent condition. The shift from phase to pattern is subtle but decisive. A phase implies temporariness, something that will pass. A pattern implies structure, something that repeats reliably. When silence becomes a pattern, it stops being something that happens and becomes something the relationship is built on. Attachment patterns respond to this stabilization with withdrawal of their own. The person who was waiting, reaching out, hoping for change, begins to mirror the distance they've been receiving. Not out of spite, out of survival. Emotional withdrawal isn't always intentional. Sometimes it's just the nervous system protecting itself from further disappointment. What's striking about this stage is how quiet it is. There's no confrontation, no final conversation, no moment where someone announces that things have changed. Both people simply begin operating within the new structure. The one who pulled back first has grown comfortable in the space. The one who waited has stopped waiting. Behavior analysis shows that this is often where relationships silently end without anyone officially ending them. The connection doesn't break dramatically. It just fades, one unanswered silence at a time. Relationship patterns at this point are self-sustaining. The distance maintains itself without effort from either side. The silence has become familiar. It no longer triggers panic or confusion, it just is. And that familiarity is, in its own way, a conclusion. Not the kind that gets spoken, but the kind that gets lived. Emotional distance, once it stabilizes, rarely reverses without deliberate intervention. And intervention requires acknowledgement. But acknowledgement would mean naming what's happening, and naming it would mean confronting it. So the silence continues, steady and unbroken, holding space where connection used to be. Prolonged absence forces a kind of clarity that presence never does. When someone is consistently unavailable, the person left waiting begins to see themselves more clearly. They notice how much energy they've been giving. They see how long they've been tolerating distance. They recognize patterns in their own emotional behavior, how they justify, adapt, and excuse. This isn't self-criticism. It's self-awareness born from sustained emotional withdrawal. Relationship psychology identifies this as a natural byproduct of unmet emotional needs. When the external source of connection becomes unreliable, the internal observer becomes sharper. Psychological dynamics shift from focusing outward to focusing inward. This clarity doesn't arrive as revelation, it accumulates. Each time they wait, and nothing comes, they learn something about their own capacity for patience. Each time they reach out and the effort isn't returned, they learn something about their own thresholds. Attachment patterns, when tested repeatedly, reveal their structure. The person begins to see how they've been operating, what they've been willing to accept, how much they've been willing to carry, where they've placed their sense of worth. Behavior analysis, when turned inward, is uncomfortable. But it's also precise. It shows the gap between how someone wants to be treated and what they've been allowing. What makes this stage significant is that self-awareness doesn't immediately lead to action. It leads to recognition. The person doesn't necessarily leave or confront or change the situation right away. They just start seeing it more clearly. They notice their own discomfort without rushing to fix it. They acknowledge their own needs without demanding that someone else meet them. Emotional distance from the other person creates emotional proximity to the self. Relationship patterns that once felt confusing begin to make sense when examined from this new vantage point. The issue isn't that the other person changed, it's that the dynamic was already unsustainable, and the silence simply made it visible. This self-awareness is quiet, but it's structural. It changes how the person interprets their own feelings. It shifts how they respond to future absence. It recalibrates their sense of what they're willing to tolerate. Psychological dynamics here are foundational. The person isn't angrier, they're clearer. And clarity, once it settles in, tends to guide decisions more reliably than emotion ever does. The absence didn't just reveal the other person's behavior, it revealed their own. And that revelation is the kind that rarely gets forgotten. At some point, distance stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like normalcy. The space that once caused discomfort becomes simply the way things are. The person who used to feel close now feels remote, and that remoteness no longer triggers alarm. It just registers as fact. Emotional behavior at this stage has fully adapted. The nervous system has recalibrated. What once required explanation now requires none. Relationship psychology calls this habituation, the process by which repeated exposure to a stimulus reduces emotional response. The distance has been present long enough that it no longer feels like distance. It feels like the baseline. This familiarity is deceptive. It's not acceptance in the sense of peace. It's acceptance in the sense of resignation. The person experiencing it isn't happy with the distance, but they're no longer fighting it. Attachment patterns have adjusted. The need for proximity has dulled. The expectation of connection has faded. Psychological dynamics have shifted from seeking closeness to managing absence. The person has learned to function within the space. They've built routines that don't include the other person. They've found ways to meet their own emotional needs, or at least to stop expecting those needs to be met by someone who isn't showing up. What makes this stage so psychologically significant is that it often marks the point of no return. Once distance becomes familiar, reversing it requires more than effort. It requires disruption of a stabilized system. Both people have adjusted to the new arrangement. The one who pulled back has grown comfortable in the space. The one who stayed has stopped reaching across it. Behavior analysis reveals that relationships at this stage are often functionally over, even if no formal ending has occurred. Emotional withdrawal has solidified. Relationship patterns have locked into place. The connection exists in name, but not in practice. The familiarity is dangerous because it can be mistaken for stability. But stability built on distance is not the same as stability built on connection. It's the stability of two people who have stopped trying to reach each other. The silence is no longer painful because it's no longer surprising. Emotional distance has become the structure itself. And once distance is the structure, closeness becomes the disruption. Which means that even if one person wanted to reconnect, the effort required would be immense. The distance has settled, and what settles rarely moves again without force. Eventually, the words stop mattering. What someone says becomes background noise compared to what they consistently fail to do. Promises lose weight. reassurances lose credibility, explanations lose relevance. The only thing that carries meaning is pattern. Relationship psychology identifies this as the point where behavior becomes the primary language. Emotional behavior is no longer interpreted through verbal communication. It's interpreted through presence, absence, consistency, and follow-through. Psychological dynamics shift entirely. The person who once listened to words now watches actions, and actions, when tracked over time, tell a story that words can't rewrite. This is where behavior analysis becomes definitive. It doesn't matter what someone says they feel or intend if their actions contradict it repeatedly. Attachment patterns respond to what is reliable, not what is claimed. When someone says they care but doesn't show up, the nervous system registers the absence, not the statement. When someone says they'll reach out but doesn't, the mind catalogs the pattern, not the promise. Relationship patterns are encoded in behavior, not language. And once the brain has seen enough repetitions, it stops giving credit to words that aren't backed by action. Emotional withdrawal speaks louder than any verbal reassurance ever could. What makes this shift so clarifying is that it removes ambiguity. Words can be manipulated, reframed, softened. Behavior can't. What someone does or doesn't do, consistently over time, is the truth. The person experiencing this shift stops asking why. They stop seeking explanations. They stop waiting for things to align. They simply observe. And observation, when it's sustained and detached, reveals everything. The relationship is no longer defined by moments of connection. It's defined by the accumulating absence of them. Emotional distance is measured not in miles, but in the growing list of things that never happen. This is not bitterness. It's clarity. The person has stopped interpreting silence as circumstance and started interpreting it as choice. Because at a certain point, repeated inaction is a choice. Psychological dynamics here are sober and final. The meaning has shifted. The focus is no longer on what might be said next. It's on what hasn't been done for weeks, months, or longer. And once meaning lives in behavior, not words, the relationship has already been redefined. The question is no longer whether connection is possible. The question is whether it was ever really there at all. In the end, the absence is the message, not the words that occasionally appear, not the explanations that no longer convince, not the promises that were never kept. The absence itself is the communication. It's the clearest, most consistent signal the person has received. Emotional behavior at this stage no longer scans for connection. It accepts the void. Relationship psychology marks this as the point of emotional detachment. The person is no longer waiting for things to improve. They're no longer hoping for change. They're simply acknowledging what has already been true for some time. The absence of response is not a gap to be filled. It's the answer. Attachment patterns, once they reach this stage, undergo a fundamental shift. The bond that required proximity now requires nothing. The need for reassurance has faded. The expectation of reciprocity has dissolved. Psychological dynamics are no longer oriented toward reconnection. They're oriented toward self-preservation. The person has stopped interpreting the silence as something that needs to be solved and started accepting it as something that already is. Behavior analysis confirms what emotional intuition has been signaling for months. This is not a phase. This is the relationship, and the relationship is defined by what doesn't happen far more than by what does. What makes the absence so definitive is its consistency. It doesn't waver. It doesn't apologize. It doesn't ask for patience. It simply continues, steady and unbroken, until the person on the receiving end stops expecting anything else. Emotional withdrawal, when it reaches this depth, doesn't reverse. It becomes the foundation. Relationship patterns built on absence are patterns of ending, even when no one has officially said goodbye. The connection has been severed not by conflict, but by sustained, repeated, silent neglect. And neglect, in its own quiet way, is one of the most honest forms of communication there is. The absence of response is no longer a problem to be fixed. It's the reality to be faced. The person experiencing it has moved through confusion, through hope, through adjustment, and arrived at acceptance. Not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that brings clarity. The silence has spoken. And what it said, in the only language that matters, is that this is over. Not dramatically, not loudly, just completely. The absence is the conclusion. And it has been, all along. The absence doesn't need to be understood. It only needs to be recognized. When someone consistently chooses distance over presence, when silence becomes more reliable than response, the relationship has already spoken. Not through conflict, not through explanation, through pattern. Emotional behavior doesn't lie. Attachment patterns don't misread sustained withdrawal. Psychological dynamics respond to what is done, not what is said. And what has been done, repeatedly, is nothing. That nothing is the answer. It's been the answer for longer than most are willing to admit. This isn't about closure or confrontation. It's about clarity. The kind that arrives quietly, after months of watching the same behavior repeat itself without variation. Relationship psychology doesn't offer comfort here. It offers truth. And the truth is that someone who wants to stay connected finds ways to stay connected. Someone who doesn't finds reasons not to. The silence that stopped responding wasn't waiting for the right moment. It was waiting for you to stop asking. And once you stop asking, once you stop waiting, the dynamic reveals itself fully. The connection wasn't lost. It was quietly released, one unanswered silence at a time. If you're still trying to make sense of when things shifted, when presence turned into absence, when connection fractured into distance, you need to go back further. Before the silence became stable, there was a moment when contact itself stopped. That rupture didn't happen all at once. It happened in stages, each one quietly dismantling the internal timeline you thought you were living in. I covered that exact moment in the previous video. The moment contact stopped, the internal timeline fractured. That's where the pattern truly began. That's where emotional withdrawal first encoded itself into the structure. If you haven't watched it, you're missing the foundation of everything this dynamic was built on. Go back, watch it, understand where the break actually started. If this resonated, if you recognized yourself in any part of this analysis, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This is where we examine relationship patterns that most people feel but never name. This is where behavior analysis meets emotional truth. Don't wait for the algorithm to show you the next one. Make sure you're here when it drops.